Have you ever owned something fair and square, only to have someone else act like it belongs to them? Well, stick around, because today I'm going to tell you how I dealt with the most entitled HOA president who thought she could claim access to my lakefront property. When she discovered I had blocked off her lake access, she completely lost it. The thing is, I wasn't even part of their HOA. What she didn't know was who she was really messing with. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll be shocked at how it all went down. This is what happens when entitlement meets reality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I purchased my dream lakefront property last spring. Beautiful 3-acre lot with 200 feet of private shoreline on Lake Evergreen. The previous owner had mentioned something about occasional issues with neighbors using the shoreline, but I figured it was just typical property boundary stuff that could be easily resolved. I'm Mason Reeves, by the way, a water rights attorney who specializes in property disputes. Not that anyone in the neighborhood knew that when I moved in. The property was perfect, secluded at the end of a long driveway, backing right up to the crystal blue waters of the lake, with gorgeous oak trees providing shade and privacy. I spent the first 2 weeks just settling in, renovating the dock, and enjoying the peaceful mornings fishing from my shoreline. The tranquility lasted exactly 16 days. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the deck when I noticed a group of people walking down my shoreline. Not just passing by, they had beach chairs, coolers, and were clearly setting up for the day. At first, I thought they had mistaken my property for a public beach access point, so I walked down to politely inform them they were on private property. "Good morning," I called out, keeping my tone friendly. "Just wanted to let you know this is private property. The public access point is about half a mile down that way." One woman with a meticulously styled blonde bob and oversized sunglasses looked at me like I'd just spoken in an alien language. She straightened up, placed her hands on her hips, and gave me a dismissive once-over. "This is the Lakeside Pines Community Beach Access," she informed me with absolute certainty. "It always has been." I shook my head. "I'm sorry, but this is my property. I purchased it from the Hendersons last month." The woman let out an exaggerated sigh and reached into her beach bag, pulling out a laminated map. She thrust it toward me, her French manicured nail tapping aggressively at a spot on the paper. "This is the designated community access point for Lakeside Pines HOA. It's in our bylaws. We've been using this access for 15 years. I examined the crude map, immediately noticing several issues. First, it wasn't an official survey document, just a hand-drawn neighborhood map. Second, the community access it showed was clearly marked within the boundaries of my property. I understand there might be some confusion, but my property deed and survey clearly show this shoreline belongs to me. I'm not part of Lakeside Pines HOA. My property is independent and predates your development." The woman's face flushed red. "I'm Veronica Hartwell, president of the Lakeside Pines Homeowners Association, and you are obviously new here and don't understand how things work." That's when I should have mentioned my profession, but something about her tone made me hold back. Instead, I simply repeated, "This is private property. I'll give you folks 15 minutes to pack up, and then I'll have to insist you leave." I turned and walked back to my house, feeling Veronica's glare burning into my back. Before I even reached my deck, I heard her on the phone, her voice carrying across the lawn. "We have a situation with the new Henderson's property owner. He's trying to block community access. Get Mitchell on the phone right away." The next morning, I found a letter taped to my mailbox. Not mailed, not placed inside, but taped to the outside where everyone could see it. The envelope had "Official HOA Notice" stamped across it in bold red letters. Inside was a letter on Lakeside Pines HOA letterhead. Dear property owner, it has come to our attention that you have violated Community Bylaw 7.3 regarding lakefront access points. All lakefront property owners must maintain open access to designated community shoreline areas as outlined in the Neighborhood Covenant. Your attempt to restrict resident access constitutes a violation subject to fines of $100 per day until compliance is restored. Please contact the HOA office immediately to resolve this matter. Regards, Veronica Hartwell, President, Lakeside Pines HOA. I nearly laughed out loud. Not only was I not a member of their HOA, but there was also no neighborhood covenant that applied to my property. The previous owners had specifically chosen this lot because it wasn't part of any planned community. I set the letter aside, making a mental note to keep it for my records. 3 days later, I installed a simple but clear boundary marker, a tasteful wooden fence with a private property sign at the point where my land met the neighboring lot. It wasn't anything aggressive, just a standard boundary fence with a gate that I kept locked. I also set up security cameras covering the shoreline and the path leading to it. The reaction was swift and disproportionate. That very afternoon, a golf cart came speeding down the path with Veronica and a man in a polo shirt with LPOA security embroidered on it. The man, who introduced himself as Mitchell Barnes, handed me another notice, this one threatening legal action for unauthorized fence installation and willful obstruction of community resources. Mr. Reeves, Veronica said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, perhaps you don't understand what's happening here. This access point has been used by our residents for over a decade. You can't just move in and change established community norms. I kept my voice calm. Ms. Hartwell, I understand you believe you have rights to this property, but legally you don't. I've checked the deed, the land survey, and there are no easements or right-of-way agreements that grant access to your HOA or its members. Mitchell stepped forward, chest puffed out importantly. We can make things very difficult for non-compliant residents, Mr. Reeves. The HOA has significant legal resources. That's interesting, I replied, because I'm not a resident of your HOA, so your bylaws don't apply to me. And threatening me could actually be considered harassment. Mitchell's confidence wavered slightly, but Veronica wasn't backing down. She pointed a finger at me. We'll see about that. The Hendersons understood how things work here. You'll learn too. With that thinly veiled threat, they turned and left. Over the next week, the intimidation escalated. Residents accidentally wandered onto my property, always feigning surprise when I pointed out they were trespassing. Anonymous complaints were made to the county about unsafe dock conditions and unauthorized landscaping on my property, triggering inspections that found nothing wrong. Someone even went so far as to cut the lock on my gate twice, which I promptly replaced with stronger ones each time. Then came the water incident. I returned home from grocery shopping to find a group of about 15 people on my dock and shoreline, having what appeared to be an HOA-sanctioned picnic. Beach chairs, coolers, children splashing in the water. They had completely taken over. Veronica sat in a folding chair right in the center, looking like a queen holding court. I approached calmly, phone in hand, recording the entire scene. Excuse me, everyone. You are currently trespassing on private property. I need to ask you all to leave immediately. Veronica stood up slowly, making a show of brushing sand from her designer capri pants. Actually, Mason, we're exactly where we're supposed to be. This is the community access point, as specified in our HOA documents. I nodded toward my phone. I'm recording this interaction for legal purposes. I've already called the sheriff's department to report the trespassing. Anyone still here when they arrive will be dealing with them directly. A murmur went through the group. Parents gathering their children, some people looking uncertainly at Veronica. Her face hardened. "You're making a very serious mistake," she said, lowering her voice. "We have board members who work for the city, the school district, the hospital. We're not people you want as enemies in this town." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was furious at the implicit threat. "That almost sounds like you're threatening to use positions of public authority for personal vendettas, Ms. Hartwell. I'm sure the County Ethics Board would find that interesting." Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected pushback. Before she could respond, someone called out that sheriff's cars were turning onto my road. The group began hastily packing up, parents hurrying children along, leaving Veronica standing alone as her support literally fled around her. When Deputy Collins arrived, Veronica immediately launched into a well-practiced speech about community access rights and long-standing arrangements. The deputy listened patiently, then asked to see any legal documentation supporting her claims. She offered the same hand-drawn map she'd shown me earlier. "Ma'am, this isn't a legal document," Deputy Collins explained. "Do you have any easement, agreements, right-of-way documentation, or court orders?" "We've been using this access point for 15 years, without any problems," she insisted. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The previous owners understood the arrangement. "Informal arrangements don't constitute legal rights," the deputy explained. "Without documentation, this appears to be private property, and Mr. Reeves has the right to control access." Veronica's face flushed with anger. "This isn't over," she hissed at me before stomping back to her golf cart. The deputy advised me to keep my security cameras running and to call immediately if there were further incidents. That night, I received an email titled "Emergency HOA Board Meeting, Lake Access Dispute." Though it wasn't addressed to me directly, someone had apparently included my email address in the distribution. The message announced an emergency meeting to discuss legal strategies for preserving community lake access rights in the face of hostile obstruction. I smiled to myself. They still had no idea who they were dealing with. I decided it was time to attend an HOA meeting. The following evening, I arrived at the Lakeside Pines clubhouse just as the meeting was getting started. The room was packed. Clearly, Veronica had rallied the troops. Conversations hushed as I walked in and took a seat in the back row. Veronica, at the front table with the rest of the board members, faltered mid-sentence when she spotted me. "Mr. Reeves," she said, recovering quickly, "this is a private HOA meeting for members only." I smiled pleasantly. "Actually, the notice said it was regarding lake access that directly involves my property, so I have a vested interest in these proceedings. I'm here as an interested party." Mitchell, sitting beside Veronica, leaned over and whispered something to her. She frowned, but continued with the meeting. "As you all know, we've had an issue with access to our traditional community lake point," she began, casting a pointed look my way. "For 15 years, Lakeside Pines residents have enjoyed this access point for swimming, fishing, and boating. Now, the new owner of the adjacent property is attempting to block this long-standing community resource." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. I remained silent, observing. "The board has consulted with legal counsel," she continued, "and we believe we have grounds for claiming prescriptive easement due to our continuous use of this access point for over a decade." That's when I decided it was time to introduce myself properly. I raised my hand, and Veronica reluctantly acknowledged me. "I'd like to address some factual inaccuracies," I said, standing up. "My name is Mason Reeves, and I'm the owner of the property in question. What Ms. Hartwell hasn't mentioned is that my property deed explicitly states there are no easements or rights of way granted to adjacent properties or communities. Additionally, the previous owners, the Hendersons, have provided written confirmation that they never granted formal permission for community access. They merely tolerated occasional use as a neighborly courtesy. The room grew quiet as I continued. Furthermore, under state law, prescriptive easements require not just continuous use, but use that is actual, open, notorious, exclusive, and hostile against the rights of the true owner. Permissive use, even implied permission, defeats a prescriptive easement claim. Veronica's face had gone from confident to concerned. "And you know this how, exactly?" I smiled. I should have introduced myself more fully. I'm Mason Reeves, water rights attorney with Caldwell, Reeves and Jefferson. I've specialized in lakefront property disputes for the past 11 years and have represented clients before the state Supreme Court 3 times on prescriptive easement cases very similar to this one. The silence in the room was deafening. Mitchell actually put his head in his hands. A few board members exchanged worried glances. "So," I continued, "before the HOA spends member funds on legal action that has virtually no chance of success, I wanted to introduce myself and suggest we find a more productive path forward." Veronica's expression hardened. "We'll see what our attorneys have to say about that." "By all means," I replied. "I look forward to the discussion. Oh, and you should know that I've documented every instance of trespassing, every threatening notice, every cut lock, and the attempt to use public officials' positions to intimidate me, just in case your attorneys want to see the full picture." I smiled politely, turned, and left the stunned room behind me. When I got home that night, I had a feeling the HOA's tactics might escalate before they improved. So I wasn't entirely surprised when my security cameras caught movement near my dock around midnight. The footage showed 2 figures in dark clothing, examining my boat and the new security gate I'd installed on the dock. They appeared to be testing the lock when my motion-activated lights flooded the area with brightness. They fled immediately, but not before my high-resolution cameras captured clear images of their faces, Mitchell Barnes and another man I recognized from the HOA board. This had gone beyond petty harassment to attempted property damage or even theft. It was time to end this once and for all. The next morning, I drove directly to the sheriff's department with my security footage and filed a formal report. Deputy Collins, who had responded to the previous incident, reviewed the footage with his sergeant. "That's clear enough for identification," the sergeant confirmed. "Would you like to press charges for attempted breaking and entering?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And I'd like a restraining order against the HOA board members to keep them off my property." Later that afternoon, I received a panicked call from someone named Linda Michaels, identifying herself as the HOA's treasurer. "Mr. Reeves, I've just learned about the incidents with your property. The board wasn't fully informed about Veronica's actions. We would very much like to discuss a reasonable resolution before this goes any further." I agreed to meet Linda and 2 other board members, notably without Veronica or Mitchell present, at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. What they revealed confirmed my suspicions. Veronica had been acting largely on her own authority, misrepresenting both the legal status of the lake access and the board's position. The community access point had been her pet project for years, and she had gradually expanded its use without proper documentation. "The truth is," Linda admitted, "most members don't even use that access point. We have a proper community dock on the other side of the lake that's actually in our HOA boundaries. Veronica just preferred your shoreline because it's closer to her house." We reached an agreement that day. The HOA would issue a formal acknowledgement that my property was private, with no easements or community access rights. They would communicate this clearly to all members. In return, I agreed not to pursue civil action against the HOA as an organization, though my criminal complaints against Veronica and Mitchell would proceed. 2 days later, Mitchell and Veronica were served with trespassing charges and restraining orders. The HOA held an emergency session and removed both from the board, with Linda stepping in as interim president. A formal apology was issued to me and distributed to all HOA members, along with clarification about the actual community lake access points. The aftermath was surprisingly positive. Once Veronica's reign of intimidation ended, several neighbors actually came by to introduce themselves properly. 3 different residents told me similar stories of harassment and arbitrary rule enforcement under her leadership. As for Veronica, I heard she put her house up for sale shortly after the criminal charges were filed. Mitchell apparently moved out of state to be closer to family. The new HOA leadership established clear, lawful policies, and the community began to heal from what had apparently been years of toxic governance. I still enjoy my peaceful lakefront mornings, but now I occasionally invite some of my actual neighbors over for barbecues on my dock. It turns out that when you remove entitled people who believe rules don't apply to them, communities can become pretty wonderful places. The following week turned into a full-blown war. I woke up Monday morning to find my dock had been vandalized overnight. Someone had spray-painted community access in bold red letters across the wooden planks. My security cameras had been cleverly avoided, suggesting this wasn't just random mischief, but a calculated move. I filed another police report, but without evidence identifying the culprits. There wasn't much the sheriff's department could do. They increased patrols around my property, which I appreciated, but I knew this was far from over. That afternoon, I received a certified letter, not from the HOA this time, but from Westlake Partners, a prestigious law firm representing them. The letter claimed they were pursuing legal action to establish a prescriptive easement on my property, citing decades of established use. They demanded I remove all barriers immediately or face substantial legal consequences. I almost admired their audacity, almost. I drafted a response on my firm's letterhead, systematically dismantling their legal argument and attaching documented evidence. My clear title, historical surveys showing no easements, and signed statements from previous owners confirming they had never granted formal permission for HOA use. I also included a countersuit for harassment, trespassing, and property damage, with a figure that made my calculator groan. 2 days later, I discovered flyers had been distributed throughout the neighborhood. They portrayed me as a villainous outsider trying to steal community resources and urged residents to stand together against my selfish privatization of the lake. The flyer included my home address and encouraged neighbors to make their voices heard. That night, car horns blared past my house until 2 a.m. Veronica had mobilized her troops, and they were playing dirty. I installed additional security cameras and motion-activated lights around the entire perimeter of my property. The weekend brought an unexpected development. An elderly gentleman knocked on my door, introducing himself as Frank Wilson, a longtime resident who lived across the street. "I wanted to apologize for what's happening," he said, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "Most of us aren't involved in Veronica's crusade. She's been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for years." Frank revealed that Veronica had deliberately misrepresented the situation to many residents, claiming I was trying to privatize the entire lakefront. He also shared something invaluable: the original neighborhood plans from when Lakeside Pines was developed. "The actual community access is supposed to be here," he said, pointing to a location nearly a quarter-mile from my property. "The developer designated that cove as community property, but it needs dredging and dock repairs. Veronica diverted maintenance funds to other projects and started using your shoreline instead because it was more convenient for her. Armed with this new information, I began quietly contacting other homeowners, showing them the original plans and explaining the legal realities. Several expressed surprise. They'd been told a completely different story by the HOA board. The HOA's attorney requested an emergency injunction to prevent me from obstructing historical access while their case proceeded. Judge Marissa Townsend, known for her no-nonsense approach, presided over the hearing. Veronica sat confidently beside her attorney, shooting me smug glances across the courtroom. Their attorney, a slick gentleman in an expensive suit, presented their case first, spinning, a tale of community tradition and shared resources. He showed photos of families enjoying the community beach over the years, carefully avoiding any mention of property lines or legal documentation. Your Honor, for 15 years, Lakeside Pines residents have used this access point without issue. The previous owner never objected to this use, establishing a clear pattern of accepted community access. Mr. Reeves is attempting to unilaterally revoke this long-standing arrangement. When my turn came, I approached the bench with 3 documents: the property survey, my deed, and a surprise, a sworn affidavit from Harold Henderson, the previous owner. Your Honor, I began, the HOA's entire claim rests on the assertion that community access has been ongoing, uncontested, and without permission. This affidavit from the previous owner directly contradicts that claim. I handed the document to the clerk. Mr. Henderson states clearly that he occasionally allowed neighbors to use his shoreline as a personal courtesy, but explicitly denied any formal arrangement with the HOA. In fact, he documents 3 separate occasions when he asked Ms. Hartwell to stop organizing official HOA events on his property. The attorney attempted to object, claiming the affidavit was hearsay, but Judge Townsend overruled him. This is a properly executed sworn statement and is admissible for this hearing. I continued by presenting the original development plans Frank had provided. Furthermore, Your Honor, the HOA has been misleading its own members. These original plans clearly show the designated community access point is actually located elsewhere. Ms. Hartwell has been diverting HOA funds away from maintaining the legitimate access point while encouraging trespassing on my property. Judge Townsend reviewed both documents carefully, then looked up at Veronica's attorney. Counselor, this directly contradicts your claim of hostile use without permission. Permissive use cannot establish a prescriptive easement. And these development plans raise serious questions about the HOA's representations to its members and this court. The attorney stammered, clearly blindsided by both documents. Judge Townsend denied their injunction and scheduled a full hearing for the following month, but her skepticism about their case was obvious. Furthermore, she added, I'm ordering the HOA to cease any organized activities on Mr. Reeves's property. Pending resolution of this matter, any violation of this order will result in contempt charges. Outside the courthouse, Veronica approached me, her face flushed with anger. You think you're so clever with your legal tricks, she hissed. But you don't understand how things work here. This is our community, our lake. We take care of our own. Is that a threat, Ms. Hartwell? I asked calmly, noting that several people were within earshot. It's a promise, she replied before storming off to her Mercedes. That weekend, things escalated beyond anything I had anticipated. I returned from grocery shopping to find nearly 30 people on my shoreline. They had set up a full beach party, complete with a banner reading, Community Lake Day. Veronica stood front and center, directing people where to set up. I called the sheriff immediately, then approached the group, phone recording. You are all trespassing on private property. The sheriff is on his way. Anyone remaining when they arrive will be subject to arrest. Most families began packing up, looking uncomfortable, but Veronica rallied her diehards. We have every right to be here. This is community property. Don't let him intimidate you." She pointed at me, her voice rising to a pitch that made several children look alarmed. "This man is trying to steal what's belonged to our community. For years, we won't be bullied by outsiders." When Deputies Collins and Martinez arrived, they found Veronica and 7 others refusing to leave. After giving them multiple warnings, the deputies began issuing trespassing citations. Veronica's outrage reached new heights as she received her citation. "Do you know who my husband is?" she shouted at Deputy Collins. "He's the city manager. You'll regret this. I'll have your badge." Deputy Collins remained professional. "Ma'am, threatening an officer with your husband's position could constitute attempted intimidation of law enforcement. I suggest you accept the citation and leave the property peacefully." As the deputies escorted the remaining trespassers off my property, one of them, a woman I recognized from the HOA meeting, turned to Veronica. "You told us we had legal right to be here. You said the judge ruled in our favor." The revelation that Veronica had lied about the court's decision spread quickly. The next day, local news ran the story. HOA president cited for trespassing in lake access dispute. The article was surprisingly balanced, including statements from both sides and pointing out the lack of legal documentation for the HOA's claims. Public opinion began to shift. Several Lakeside Pines residents contacted me privately, apologizing and distancing themselves from Veronica's actions. Some even admitted they'd been pressured into participating in her campaign against me through threats of selective enforcement of HOA rules against their properties. The tide was turning, but I knew Veronica wouldn't go down without one last fight. Her reputation and authority were at stake, and people like her rarely surrender power quietly. I reinforced my security measures and prepared for whatever might come next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.